Serving it up to you live on the Buffalo Rumblings Vidcast Network. I'm Bruce Nolan, that's Nate Geary, and this is Food for Thought. The topic du jour, the 53. When I say it that way, it sounds very dramatic. It sounds almost like it's supposed to be a CW show with unusually attractive people. I just feel like there's some teen drama-ish feel to the 53. Nate, how you doing this evening, man?
Yeah, sounds like a Hillary Duff reboot, something, ABC Family, something along those lines for sure. Yeah, no, I'm well. I know we've got quite the platter to talk about this evening, so I'm looking forward to hash out the 53-man roster. Looking forward to having our friend Jay Skursky from the Buffalo News hanging out with us as well to get his 53-man roster thoughts. So a lot to get to tonight, and I'm excited to do it.
Well, without further ado, let's kick it off with, quite frankly, the most pressing of all topics.
Yes.
And that is, there was some discussion. There was some dialogue on the Twitter machine today about the best way to reheat pizza. Now, I will offer up my opinion at the very beginning. So, as a poor bachelor, very early in my adult life, I really didn't have much of an option for this. I had a microwave and that's it. That's really all I had. I had a microwave. I'm not entirely sure I even knew how to use the stove, so that was all I had. Then I upgraded from microwave to microwave with a glass of water next to it to increase the humidity in the microwave, and I thought that helped a little bit. Then I moved forward to oven, and I was very excited about oven. Then I finally reached the pinnacle. I reached the top of reheating pizza consciousness, and that was
wokeness.
The air fryer. I use the air fryer as often as possible now. I'm a big air fryer guy. There is a line of thinking that I feel really strongly about that says if you use a cast iron skillet and you are able to get the bottom crispy and then you drop a little bit of water in there for the steam and then cover it to get the cheese melty, that's the good thing. However, what I found is that the margin for error is usually pretty high on that. A little too long and you're screwed, a little bit not long enough and you're screwed. So for me, the same reason I like sous vide is the same reason I like an air fryer. It takes the dummy work out of it.
Yeah.
It almost dummy proofs the issue. So for me, it's air fryer. If you're in the comment section with me, please hit me up. Make sure you tell me best way to reheat pizza. Nate, I'd love to get your thoughts.
We're not far off, but especially if we're talking a slice, 2 slices, toaster oven is where you got to be. Now, the problem is not everybody in the Lord's year 2021 still has a toaster oven. They're kind of not the in vogue kitchen resource that they were, as I was growing up, because I grew up with, a toaster oven in my house. We didn't use a normal toaster. And in my opinion, you get especially because it's just very close to the heating source at the top there. You get the nice melt over the top. It takes about 2.5 minutes at 400. Boom, you're in, you're out, you're melted, you're back warm. But here's the thing, Bruce, and this maybe isn't as much of a take as it is an admission of guilt. But growing, you mentioned in your single bachelor days, well, that's where a lot of my habits kicked in when I had my roommate and my good buddy with me. And when we were just out of college and in crappy jobs, what we would do was just buy Domino's pizza because it was down the street from us in the city. I know, I'm in Buffalo, and I was eating Domino's pizza a lot. I like Domino's. Get over it. The one thing about Domino's, though, Bruce, doesn't really reheat well. I mean, it's borderline fresh. So when you go to the reheat option, you learn very quickly that just eat as much pizza as possible right now. Try to finish the whole pie rather than putting it in the refrigerator and saving it for a rainy day. So I think for me, the best leftover pizza is fresh pizza.
And that's exactly what we got from in the comments. Just spin 0481 says just buy a new pizza. And let's be honest, part of the reason why we like pizza, especially as poor bachelors, is the value proposition. It's the idea.
It's the idea of it, though.
Multiple meals out of it, not even multiple meaningful meals, just multiple meals. So I think that there's a longevity discussion to be had. As long as you find a good way to reheat pizza, you're able to fully realize the potential of pizza. because that's really what it is. It's the potential of pizza. Because how many old pieces of pizza have we thrown away? I think famously, there was a Philadelphia Eagles player who once missed a practice because he ate pizza that was too old and got sick. Correct me if I'm wrong. It might have been Zach Ertz when he was a rookie. I'm not entirely sure, but
I'd like to commit to finding out the answer to that question, because if you've gotten to the point where you've eaten pizza that makes you sick, what are we doing? What are we doing here as men? What are we doing? Especially one that, like Zach Ertz, you're a professional athlete. You can't be relying on days old pizza. Listen to it. It's the same thing. Like it's got dairy on it, man. It's got cheese on it. It only lasts a certain while. And I used to have this pet peeve where my roommate would save pizza, but he wouldn't cover it. He would just keep it in the box and put it in the refrigerator. That does nothing if it's sitting out in the refrigerator. It might as well be sitting out, on the counter. There's no difference there.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I feel like no one's really ever perfected it. And in the time when you get to perfect it, it's later on in your life where you're no longer able to really appreciate it. It's almost like
you're not eating pizza at the volume you used to. Listen, I mean, I love pizza. At this point in my life, I am not eating it at the volume that I was. But before we move on into the important topics for tonight, and yes, of course, Matt Warren is a little thrown off about my Domino's take, but live with it, people. I think you and I have to at least just mention Pat Moran's take today on Twitter was borderline, cancelable. I think it was, or was it yesterday? I think it was yesterday. His tweet about Picasso's Pizza, which I very gladly introduced you to, Bruce. There are some of the takes I did agree about Picasso. Sometimes Picasso's isn't like an everyday starter. Picasso's is when you've had the same type of buffalo pizza over and over and over again, and you want to have that change of pace back, as somebody put it. The Darren Sproles, the real home run hitter. That's Picasso. So I've got to really push hard back, as Picasso's did on Twitter. By the way, as the kids would say, Bruce, Picasso's clap back on Pat Moran on Twitter.
And you know what? I can appreciate that. I can appreciate a pizza company with a good social media presence, because that's right up there with good cheese. Good cheese, social media presence, all this stuff is really important. My wife, after she had the Picasso's pizza that you so graciously introduced us to, she said it was, quote, the best pizza she's ever had, unquote. And Mrs. Nolan, not known for being hyperbolic. I mean, Mrs. Nolan has had a lot of pizza. She's lived a lot of places because she's transparent, honest, not prone to swings left and right, not emotionally not in the moment,
not an east-west runner, north-south.
All right, let's do it. We have 53-man roster projections. You got yours. I got mine. We are going to go room by room. This is the first and last chance we're going to have an opportunity to have this discussion. Now, we know full well that there will probably be roster shenanigans by Brandon Beane. So it should be noted that before we get into this, that if there are roster shenanigans in regards to certain players that are going to be moved around right after the 53-man roster is set, that we should know about them. So before we get started, it should be noted that there are rules here. If you put a player on injured reserve before the 53-man roster is set, they are gone for the season. If you put them on injured reserve after the 53-man roster is set, they can return, which means you need roster spots to be able to pull that off. The way that teams historically pull that off is they find vested veterans who are not subject to waivers. They cut them, say hi, wink, wink, nod, nod, go wait in the parking lot for a day. Come back, I'll give you $30,000 signing bonus for your trouble. And in doing so, I will allow myself to keep someone on the roster, set the initial 53-man roster, then put them on IR so they can come back, and then re-sign the other player. You have to find people who are both vested veterans and also have a small amount of dead cap hit to be able to pull that off. So it should be noted that do not freak out if you see Brandon Beane cut someone unexpected. We are going to go through some of those things.
The Andre Roberts scenario playing out just once again, right?
Absolutely. Let's start with quarterbacks. Nate, who you got?
Easy, 2 quarterbacks. There's just not enough room on this roster to keep 3. Sean McDermott already said he's not keeping a 3rd quarterback for the COVID rules this year. I suspect Davis Webb is this team's practice squad quarterback, and Jake Fromm gets cut loose. We'll see with the amount of roster practice squad positions if Fromm also returns to this team on a practice squad. But two quarterbacks, Trubisky, Allen.
It is not insane to keep 2 practice squad quarterbacks given the expanded size of the practice squad. I have the exact same thing. Allen, Trubisky. Moving on, running backs. I will go first. I have 3, but remember, shenanigans. Singletary, Moss, Breida. I do think Taiwan Jones will end up back on this team, but I think he gets cut in the initial round, and he will wait in the parking lot to make a room for somebody else. Nate.
I exactly agree with that. Taiwan Jones is the easy candidate for all this. And frankly, he's become a borderline candidate for me because of how many other guys they're going to keep on this roster that specifically play special teams. Now, I get it. He is an elite gunner on the punt team, and he's a really good kickoff guy. But, I mean, when we're talking about are we keeping seven wide receivers, we'll see as we get into that position group how that works out. If they're keeping 7 receivers, which I think they should based on the concerns with the COVID over the last couple of days and seeing, Cole Beasley go out. And I'm a little worried about this team and how much they rely on the wide receiver position, keeping 7, including Jake Kumro. Could he be a guy that you could put out? And could he take over for Taiwan Jones? So I look at Taiwan Jones as that candidate to get cut and brought back, but I also view him as just a true cut candidate. Taiwan Jones, 3 running backs.
Moving to wide receivers. Nate, you're up first.
Wide receiver, I'm keeping 7. And the last 2 guys I'm keeping, obviously I have Isaiah McKenzie 5, I have Kumaro 6, and I have Marquez Stevenson as 7. And I think it's very possible Isaiah McKenzie could be a candidate that they can bring back as well. But I think at this point he's turned himself into a roster lock. I think he's almost moved himself above the kind of candidate that gets cut, but he is a vested veteran. And it could be one of those candidates if Brandon Beane finds value in doing that with him.
I have the Bills keeping 8 wide receivers. Yes, I know it sounds insane, but again, please hear me out. They're actually only going to keep 7. But remember that roster spot we needed from Jones? We're using it here. Diggs, Sanders, Beasley, Davis, McKenzie, Kumaro, Stevenson, Hodgins. Now, McKenzie is your player you want to move to IR. He's been in a sling, which means we would like him to come back, but we want to use that roster spot. So he makes the initial and then gets put on IR so Taiwan Jones can get brought back. So again, the Bills are actually keeping 7 because McKenzie ends up being on IR temporarily and we bring him back. His spot is just a placeholder for Taiwan Jones to come back. So you got to think Jones, McKenzie, those 2 swap. Moving on to the tight ends. I'm going to go first. 2, Knox, Hollister. Sorry, Knox and Gilliam. Knox and Gilliam are the 2. Hollister is, again, a wait in the parking lot guy. So, again, I do think that they will end up being 3, but the initial 53-man roster will only have 2 on them. It'll be Knox and Gilliam. Technically, he's a fullback. You can view it that way if you prefer, but Hollister is another one of those wait in the parking lot kind of guys. If I want to free up a spot, and you will see later, I do want to free up a spot. My Jones spot was used for McKenzie, and my Hollister spot will be used for somebody else. Nate.
I'm on the same page with you again. I believe Gilliam also gets the nod there because of the versatility. He's shown that he's a guy that can carry the ball. He can catch the ball. He can line up at fullback, H-back, inline tight end. That versatility is going to be the reason that that you ultimately see Reggie Gilliam make the team. I agree. 3 tight ends. He'll be listed as a tight end / fullback, but he's going to count under that roster for 3 tight ends. And that gets us through the skilled position at 15, right? Is that where we're at? Or are we just above that now?
I think we're at 2, 3, 8, 2. So that's 15.
15. We're at 15.
All right. Offensive line. Let's go with you first.
So obviously you have the starting group of 5, and I believe Cody Ford ends up being in that group. And then this is where things get tricky. Ryan Bates, lock. Ike Bottker at this point, I believe, is pretty close to a lock. I think Spencer Brown's obviously a lock as well. That gets us to 8. The question is, does this team have the ability to get to 9? And I have the feeling you're going to come back with me with another potential option for this team to maybe to get creative here with short-term IR. But I don't think this is a team that's going to let Tommy Doyle go to conditional waivers. So I think for me, Tommy Doyle also has to be there, and that gets us to 9 on the offensive line. I think that's a lot.
I have the exact same 9. Dawkins, Feliciano, Morse, Ford, Williams, Brown, Doyle, Butker, Bates. Bates
is a lock.
There's no way you can have Bobby Hart make this team. I do believe that Ryan Bates is a lock. I think his ability to play all 5 is nice. The fact that he's been operating as solely the backup center would tell you a little bit about the way that the Bills feel about him, because you would think that they would bump Feliciano over, because that's what we saw a little bit. But having Ryan Bates operate almost exclusively as a backup center, I think actually increases his chance of making this team. We are through the offense. It is time to the defense. We're going to start with defensive line. I have the Bills keeping 11. Remember that roster spot that I needed, that I got from Hollister? I'm going to use it right now on Harrison Phillips for short-term IR. So Hughes, Addison, Epinesa, Rousseau, Basham, Obata, Johnson, Oliver, Butler, Zimmer, Harrison Phillips. I do think that there's a possibility that Vernon Butler could have been the odd man out despite his contract, but Harrison Phillips got hurt.
Yep.
So now we need another body there. So I think that Harrison Phillips ends up being the IR spot to bring Hollister back, and McKenzie ends up being the IR spot to bring Jones back. So you see, these are the 2 spots that correlate with each other. 11, I think that this is the deepest section of the team.
No doubt.
In an area of the team that the team wanted to be the deepest at. So I don't think you go out there and you cut your knees off at the very bottom and say, yes, everything we've been trying to achieve with the defensive line shakeups that happened in 2020 and then again in 2021, we finally got the depth we want, and now we're going to cut it. I don't think that's going to happen. I think they'll find ways to make it work. I have them keeping 11.
I'm on with you on that. I've got 11. I think that's been the number all along since the beginning of the season, since the beginning of training camp. And I think you have enough position flexibility there as well to get to a point where when Harrison Phillips comes back, though, they're going to have discussions here, Bruce, because ultimately I don't think this is a team that wants to see if Zimmer can make it back to the practice squad and pass through waivers. I'm not sure that's something they feel comfortable with, which makes me believe, I'm on the same boat as you, that had Harrison Phillips not been injured, Vernon Butler was likely the odd man out. So we'll see how that plays out once Phillips is 100% healthy and back in the lineup.
One of the things that I think you got to put your thinking caps on when you're thinking about the players that the team is going to expose to waivers is, number one, have they exposed them to waivers before?
Yeah.
Because if they have, and they haven't gotten any bites before, then there's a very reasonable chance that the team is going to feel comfortable doing it again. And the other thing is that, the reason why Tommy Doyle is going to make this team is because the Bills don't want to expose him to waivers. Right. Now, we know full well that it's not super often that a team gets a player plucked from waivers. That's just not a extremely common thing. But teams like to keep their players in-house if at all possible. Moving on to linebackers. You are up.
This was really tough for me. I've got them at 6, and I think this is going to be where the roster crunch starts to happen, particularly the Taiwan Jones argument that I made earlier about special teams. We've got people talking in our chat about Bam Johnson being gone, and I say no way. This is a group of coaches. This is a general manager that have consistently stated in front of the media, and I said this before and I'll say it again, when the coach and the GM talk about specific players in the media, very rarely I'm taking coaches and I'm taking the general manager at face value. Bam Johnson is very safe on this roster because of his ability to play special teams. And this team values that. And that's part of what makes this decision at the linebacker position so difficult. But I do think ultimately that your top 3 are Edmonds, Milano, Klein. I believe 4 and 5 are Dotson and Andre Smith. And I think Andre Smith has crept into the top 4 discussion there over Tyrell Dotson. And Tyler Matakavich is another guy that this team has restructured. Therefore, he is on this roster. But the question is, do they try to do any maneuvering here at linebacker? And do they believe that they might be able to cover a Tyrell Dotson with Andre Smith, and maybe he's an odd man out there? Maybe you only keep 5 linebackers. But right now, I've got 6.
6. Edmonds, Mulatto, Klein, Smith, Matakevich, Dotson. I think that's, it's amazing. The more I do these things, the less variance I get in them. And I think really less variance in 53-man roster projections speaks primarily to how good the team is.
Yep.
I think the more variance you get in 53-man final roster projections, the more questions there are up in the air. The worse your team is, the more questions they have. The more questions they have, the more roster spots are up for grabs. We should be viewing this boring 53-man roster projection as a good thing.
Yeah.
Boring is good. You know what else is boring? Winning. Let's do it. I'm all about it. Cornerbacks. I have the Bills with 5.
Yes.
White, Wallace, Johnson, Jackson, Neal. Remember, there was one player that canceled out another player. I've done it twice already. I had Jones and McKenzie, and then I had Hollister and Phillips. I'm going to do it one more time. The Bills are going to cut Cam Lewis. So I do think there's a chance Cam Lewis ends up back on this team, but they've exposed him to waivers multiple times before with no bites. So I would not be shocked if they do it so that they can add someone else who we'll talk about later on to injured reserve. Nate.
5 with you as well. I think Nick McLeod has made a case to be a guy that could push for a 6th corner spot. The question that I would have is how versatile does this team? This team values Cyril Neal a lot. I don't believe he has the versatility that you can shave a safety in order to make room for a 6th corner that if you have an injury, you can move somebody back to safety like Cyril Neal. I think he's really separated himself as that second slot defender on this defense, but can also play outside if push comes to shove and injury happens. I think Nick McLeod, Rashad Wildgoose, and Cam Lewis all end up on this team's practice squad.
Moving along to the final countdown. Safeties. Nate, you're up.
Well, we just based on pure numbers that we currently have existing, we are down to 4 with 3 additional or with the 3 specialists of Ferguson, Hawk, and Bass. Obviously, we've got 4 spots left on this roster to fill. And obviously the first 2 are givens here, Poyer and Hyde. I think the third is a given as well. I think Jaquan Johnson is the third safety in this group. And the difference between Damar Hamlin and Josh Thomas is so thin. I think this team is in a really good position at the backup safety. This was a position I believe they wanted to continue adding depth to. So I think it's unfortunate here that they're going to likely have to make a decision between Thomas and Hamlin. And I ultimately think they go with Hamlin here. And he is this team's 4th safety. Josh Thomas ultimately gets cut and hopefully makes it through and is on this team's practice squad going into the season. I think this is the safety position. The number 4 safety position was one of the more competitive competitions in this year's training camp. And it's no slight to Josh Thomas, who I thought had a great training camp, a great preseason. He could still potentially make a statement in tomorrow's game. I'm not sure that there are too many positions that aren't sort of wrapped up right now. This might be the only one up for grabs with a good game or a standout game maybe being the difference.
So you and I went in different directions here. I have Hyde, Poyer, Jaquan Johnson, and Josh Thomas. Mind you, Jaquan Johnson is one of those players that you want to put on short-term IR for designation return. And what do you do with him? Once you do that, you bring back Cam Lewis. So again, there are 3 player swaps involved in this. There's 3 instances of roster shenanigans. Tywan Jones for Isaiah McKenzie, Jacob Hollister for Harrison Phillips, and Cam Lewis for Jaquan Johnson. 3 individual shenanigans that happened the day after cut down day in order to make all this stuff happen. So I went Thomas, you went Hamlin. You could go either way. Ironically enough, I did all this stuff, and then I was looking through, and Joe Buscaglia of The Athletic did a 53-man roster projection, I think it was yesterday or something like that. He and I had almost exactly the same one except for the safety. The safety positions were a little bit different. I think they were swapped Hamlin and Thomas. And I was like, okay, I swear I'm not just copying off the cool kids' homework. That's not what I'm doing. But
listen, when you're coming up with the same roster projection as Joe B, you're feeling pretty good, Yeah,
I was feeling pretty good about myself. Now, you know what? We have to do specialists because punters are people too, as EB has told me in the comments section. Thank you so much. All right, I'll level with you. I've got Bass, Hawk, and Ferguson. So what do you got?
If it's different than that, I'd like to know how.
I think the interesting thing this particular offseason was there was no competition brought in. There was no kicker competition. None. There was no punter competition, which is very unusual because usually you want at least a camp leg. And I don't know exactly what the line of thinking there. I'd be interested to probably, talk to Sean McDermott. If I had it in front of me, I would say, hey, what was the line of thinking between not bringing in a camp leg at punter or kicker? But sure enough, there we were. Okay, we are done with our 53-man roster projection. We got through as we wait for Mr. Jay Skursky. Nate, you and I, we had a little bit of a buzz today with some fantasy football discussions that you and I had. And Mr. Joe Marino wanted us to talk about it on the pod tonight. It was interesting. For those of you who do not know, so there are some Bills media and Bills content creators who are involved in a fantasy football draft. And Nate and I were nice enough to, be able to make a transaction. And we're going to tell you a little bit about that transaction after we have an opportunity to talk to Mr. Jay Skursky, who just popped up with us here on the Food for Thought. Mr. Skursky, thanks so much for being here, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Sorry, I was I was having some technical difficulties. I feel like Jerry Sullivan right now. Go back to one of my old coworkers. But yes, thank you for having me. I'm here now and doing well.
So Nate and I were doing a 53-man roster projection, and there are some narratives at specific positions, and that's kind of what we want to talk to you a little bit about. One of the first things I want to ask about is the backup safety spot, because I went Thomas, Nate went Hamlin, Joe Buscaglia went Thomas. That fourth safety spot is kind of interesting, and it might be all the way to the wire. We could be watching an actual meaningful roster spot battle in a third preseason game, which is very unusual. Where do you currently have that fourth safety spot going, and what do you think of it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, well, number one, we've got to get an update, more detail, at least on Jaquan Johnson, right? First of all, I mean, that could really factor into this. If that knee injury is serious enough that it's going to keep him out of games when the regular season starts, maybe you try to figure out a way to have him make the 53 and then you put him on injured reserve. Maybe you cut Thomas with the idea that you're going to re-sign him shortly after the fact. So I think it's a possibility that both of them, particularly if Jaquan Johnson isn't healthy enough, make the team. I would lean toward Hamlin only because I favor draft picks making this roster. I mean, when you look at I did the numbers. I wish I had it in front of me. It's something like 23 out of 27 of Bean's picks, might even be a little higher, might be 24 or 27, have spent time on the 53-man roster, have made the team. The seventh round receiver from North Carolina, his name escapes me right now. He didn't make it. And there was like one other one. And, Fromm hasn't played in a game, but he spent all the last season on the 53. The point there is that Brandon Beane is going to give his draft picks every opportunity to make the team. So that's why I think I would lean toward Hamlin right now. I agree that Josh Thomas, I think, is done a nice job. He's done everything asked of him. And there's a very good chance, at least at the start of the season, again, depending on Johnson's health, that they end up both making the team, although it may take a little bit of maneuvering for that to be the case.
Jay, I think a good follow-up question is something you mentioned there about how they may have some of these vested veterans, as Bruce would put it, hang out in the parking lot after the first 53-man roster comes out because we're going to need you guys back on the team when we make some short-term IR decisions here. How much of that type of maneuvering this year compared to years past do you believe Brandon Beane's going to have to do, considering, I mean, just as we did the exercise before you came on, tinkering with this 53-man is probably one of the more difficult ones I've had doing this exercise over the last couple of years. Like this is a lot like Tetris this year more than ever, because you're trying to find spots. Are they going to keep 7? We've got 8 receivers with one of them going to IR and Hodgins sort of being that 7th guy on the 53-man roster. Like that, you could talk me out of that, and I think you could probably talk Bruce out of that. But I think the question here is how much tinkering with this long-term or the short-term IR, getting guys to the 53, and then ultimately moving them to short-term IR, do you think Brandon Beane's ultimately going to have to pull to get the roster that he wants to get for game day?
Yeah, it's a good question. So what was it last year, right? It was Andre Roberts and I believe one other. where they had him make the initial 53, and then I guess they got cut, right, and then brought back so that other guys could make the initial 53. I think easily that we could see a couple of those. Now, obviously there's cap implications there that are involved. You're probably looking at doing it with lesser salaried type veterans. A guy like AJ Klein to me jumps out as a possibility. To me, that's like a logical one. There could be others though. I think, certainly. And again, I think the injuries right now, when you look at that list, I think it was 16 guys that were out of practice. Some of those may have been, with the COVID designation and they're back. But the point is that they're at the point in the preseason, at the point, the end of training camp, where that injury list has really grown pretty substantially here over the last week or two. And, the hope is, the expectation is that a lot of those aren't super long-term injuries where they're going to keep guys out. But, what do you do with a guy like Harrison Phillips? That's a really interesting one. Now, he isn't, he's not vested, right? This is his fourth season. I believe he'd have to complete this season before you could do a move like that with him. But that's who you'd be looking at, is those cheaper vested veterans. And I think I think what they did last year was 2. I could see another 2 or 3 moves easily where it's out of necessity, right? And they tell those guys, hey, listen, this is not anything to do with you. We're going to re-sign you, and, we're going to make it worth your while, right? Whether that, somehow they give them a little bit of extra something, but they don't have a lot of salary cap room to be messing around too much with there. But I definitely think 2 or 3 of those types of moves are coming. And then, the other part of this, and maybe you guys have talked about it, is, what do they do in the trade market? Are they able to swing a deal, moving, where they've got some depth pieces, whether it's D-line, O-line, wide receiver. The wide receiver, I think, over the last week has really changed, with the injuries and things like that. So, and my thing is that a lot of the times when we're talking about trades, we're thinking, oh, it's just going to be for draft picks. Well, I mean, I think there are positions on this roster where they could use a little bit of depth. I think number one is cornerback. I think they absolutely could use a little bit more cornerback depth. So can you do a player for player deal at this point in the preseason, right before the final rosters are set? It's probably not the easiest to pull off, but I think it's something that you got to keep in mind. And, we've seen Brandon Beane. He's not afraid to make deals. So I think it's possible.
Bruce, we better cool you down, buddy, with that cornerback trade talk.
You are never going to hear me complain about another corner. Andy Anderson brings in the super chat, says, Bills going 17-0. Anthony Moreno did not go far enough, predicting 16-1. Josh takes his Miami hatred to another level, breaking the hearts of the 1972 Dolphins. Andy, I appreciate you, man. Thanks for being a part of this. We are here on Food for Thought. Nate Geary, Bruce Nolan here with Jay Skursky of the Buffalo News, talking 53-man roster projections and narratives. Jay, question for you about the Bills and personnel when it comes to running the ball. One of the things that was a big part of the immediate aftermath of the 2020 season was both Brandon Beane and Sean McDermott saying, we want to run the ball more effectively. Well, then they come in to this year with effectively the same personnel in the run game on the offensive line and running the ball in the backfield. There was discussions, obviously, that was rampant before the NFL draft about adding a running back high potentially, because this team was in a win now window and they thought, hey, this is the time to get away with a luxury pick. But Matt Breida, essentially the only addition to the run game. It brings me to Reggie Gilliam. Reggie Gilliam was, of course, listed as a tight end last year. This year, he's listed as a fullback, and we got a chance to see him a little bit in that fullback role, specifically out there blocking with Zach Moss in the Chicago Bears game. I'm wondering if potentially there was a discussion about the loss of Patrick DeMarco and how that was more significant than we initially thought. Is Reggie Gilliam's maneuver from tight end to being reclassified as a fullback, is it just nonsense for a depth chart purposes? Or is this a thing where, hey, we need to commit to a fullback so that at least we have the option? I know it's not a big part of what we do, but I at least want to do it. Is there something there, or am I just reading too much into it?
No, I agree with you. I think there's definitely something there. And I think, you call it what you want, in the preseason, but, the fact that he had 8 carries, he was reasonably productive. He scored a couple of touchdowns against the Bears. It's less about that, though, and more about, to your point, the element or the wrinkle that it provides the offense. And the guy is a tremendous athlete. I'll just veer off course here just for a second. I have a good friend of mine who is on the staff at UB, on the football staff, and he works in special teams. He told me when the Bills signed Reggie Gilliam last year, texted me right away before I had even had any conversation. And he said, he will make that team. He's the best special teams player we've ever seen at UB. And, I get it, right? It's the MAC, but hey, they still, they go and they play other schools. They play some bigger schools. And he was adamant about how great he is on special teams. So I think that Reggie Gilliam, I think he surprised some people last year by making the team. But after hearing that, it wasn't as much of a surprise to me. And the fact that they're now, experimenting him, well, it's more than an experiment. They have moved him. I mean, he's definitely a fullback. That's where he's working in practice. That's what he's doing. And it's not a cliche when Sean McDermott and Brian Daboll talk about, loving position flexibility, and he's got that. And if you look at the tight end situation, how many are they going to keep? I think you can get away with keeping 3 on the 53 because you've got Gilliam who can go play there in a pinch if you need it. And yeah, I don't know exactly how much he's going to mean to the running game, how much he's going to be in there. I mean, let's face it, I know that it was a talking point. I know there was a lot of conversation about it in the draft, but this is a team that's going to throw the ball a lot. When you pay Josh Allen $250 million, you do it because you're going to throw. And I think that of course they want to run it better. They want to run it better when they have to run it better or when it's convenient to run it better. Ideally, that's in the fourth quarter of games with big leads and you want to bleed the clock. So that's when you want to run it better. So I think Gilliam is an interesting piece. I think you like having that element of the offense. It's something that, when Daboll wants to dial up something like that, he can. But I don't know that his snap count is going to drastically go up this year. I think he's going to be one of those guys that you use in certain situations. One thing that we've learned about Daboll is that it's not, he doesn't really give us a lot, right? In press conferences, he usually plays it pretty close. But when he talks about, you go into the week and it's all about matchups, that's real. That's what he means. So if he feels like Reggie Gilliam in some way is a mismatch for somebody on the Dolphins or the Jets or the Patriots or whoever it may be that they're playing, then those weeks I think we will see him playing a little bit more.
One of the things I think that people associate incorrectly sometimes is I think they associate a fullback with a man gap power run scheme. And the hilarious thing about that is some of the most well-known fullbacks in the NFL, specifically if you look at the Shanahan system in San Francisco, Kyle Juszczyk is a big part of what they do there. And that's an outside zone running system. So the fact that the Bills moved a little bit more toward outside zone and zone runs in 2020 does not at any point preclude them from usage of a fullback and having that fit. So I think that's important to note because I think that in our head, we think fullback, then we think power run. Like that's the way it works. Yeah. And that's not necessarily true, especially if you have a person who's a really good athlete at the fullback position, the way that Reggie Gilliam is.
Yeah, and I'd say Gilliam is an upgrade from DeMarco in that regard. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think too, Bruce sort of alluded to the fact that they're sort of running back the same group, Jay, that they felt they needed to somehow upgrade. So I think part of this discussion goes right to the platter of Brian Daboll, because how is Brian Daboll going to change his principles to put the same group of guys in better positions to succeed? And I think one of the interesting moves they made, and I think maybe a storyline we haven't talked quite enough about, is I do think that when you look at Cody Ford, he is one of this team's better interior run blockers. Now, whether or not we could probably all agree he at times has been early on in his career in his first 2 seasons when healthy, a liability in pass protection. And that's really where he's been hurt. Again, this is a player that's started at right tackle, played right guard last year, then the injury happened. And now here he is, Jay, starting at left guard. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are with the flip-flop of John Feliciano and he basically switching sides here. We saw Ike Butker really in that competition last year. And now we're firmly at Cody Ford at the left guard position, and sort of wondering what your overall thoughts of that are with him as basically penciled in here with the starters.
Yeah, I would say, it's about time, right? I mean, they needed to find a place for this guy. I mean, you move up in the second round for him, and he's got to be productive. He's got to be a meaningful, contributing starter. That's not to say that he has to make the Pro Bowl, but as a high second round pick, right, in the top half of the second round, you want this guy to be a starter. And yeah, I think he was I do think that we talked about that position flexibility and how Daboll favors it. And in some ways that's great. I think it helps him, but in other ways it hurt him, right? He wasn't able to just go work at one spot and say, hey, this is where we want you to excel. This is the job. This is how you need to do it at this position. They finally at least found that, and obviously we can't ignore the injury history, right? That's been significant for him too. So he's healthy. He knows where he's playing. He knows what he has to do in the starting lineup. He knows what's expected of him in his third season. I mean, I think, this is he's on the very short list, right, of guys who are having prove it years. I would say he's on that list. I think Devin Singletary's on that list. Dawson Knox is certainly on that list. There's, interestingly enough, I just named 3 guys that were all day 2 draft picks of Brandon Beane. And if anybody, follows me on social media, they maybe have, seen kind of some of my thoughts on that. I think that's one area where Beane has not hit a lot of home runs. He's maybe hit some singles, and he's potentially struck out here a little bit, particularly in that second and third round. So, I think certainly Beane is looking at this Cody Ford situation and saying, okay, you guys have him in a spot now. Now he needs to produce. And again, I think you can go down that list of those second and third rounders where that's true of a lot of them.
Jay, before we let you go for the evening, obviously the sort of news story that got us to the weekend here was the press conference yesterday with Sean McDermott and a lot of the news of some of the issues that his team is having, particularly in the public eye on social media. And, obviously I think from afar, from folks that might have been watching the press conference live or might have been watching, the news recaps, the local news recaps of it, there were, I would say it's hard to say like raw emotions with Sean McDermott. He's not a real emotional, particularly doesn't wear those emotions on his sleeve or with his facial expressions. I felt it was probably the closest thing to emotion I've seen from Sean McDermott. I think there's genuine concern there from him that this team is in a Super Bowl window and something that he believes very strongly in, which is, making sure that he's doing his, not to make a joke of it, but his 111th, like he very much uses that. He embodies that. He's talking about what he does for the country and kind of how when he says things like that, Jay, I think there's real genuine concern, like something that's keeping Sean McDermott up at night about some of the stuff that's happened this week with the roster and obviously some of these COVID protocols.
Yeah, I talked earlier about Daboll and his press conferences and not giving you a lot, and I think Sean McDermott, particularly when the season starts, he's gonna be about his guys. He's gonna be about protecting his players, and whether that's not saying a lot about injuries or certainly not saying a lot about game plans or anything like that. He is going to keep a lot of that information in-house as much as he can. And, that he's not alone in doing that as a football coach, but this is a life issue, right? This is, and I've, you hear a lot of that whole stick to football thing. Well, it is football, right? It's availability is football. And so it is a topic that has to come up. It has to be addressed. And I will say, right here, there have been a lot of times where I wish Sean McDermott might be a little bit more open with us on this conversation, on this topic. Yeah. He has been as open as he possibly can. He has spoke from the heart. He has been, he has really laid out, what the franchise has done, what he believes should happen, what he has, said to his players. I don't really think that the message from Sean McDermott and from Brandon Beane on this topic has been consistent from day one. It's been, I think, the right message. Whether you want to get into that, we certainly don't need to do that. But I think he's been very forthcoming, very steady in what he said. I think he's, spoken passionately, spoken honestly. He has given, us in the media every answer, right? We have had a lot of questions about it. I don't think we've had too many questions. I disagree. I know that has, maybe come up. I would disagree with that. I thought it was handled very fairly on both sides. I thought the media questions were fair, and I thought his answers were fair, honest, and forthcoming.
Well, Jay, we appreciate you hopping on with us and sharing some of your insight. Obviously, this is sort of the dress rehearsal, so to speak. We're seeing Bills starters play. That came to a little shock to me, and I know a lot of other Bills fans who thought the Bills were kind of going to mail this in terms of starters playing in the preseason. So we'll see that tomorrow. We look forward to all your work this upcoming season, and we thank you again for your time tonight and joining us here on Food for Thought.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate you guys having me, and keep up the great work.
Awesome. Jay Skursky of the Buffalo News joining us here on Food for Thought. We can't thank Jay for his time. We know it's valuable. Big fan of Jay's too, and have been for a long time. So I'm glad we were able to kind of get him together and get him on the podcast, Bruce. But yeah, I like a lot of what Jay had to say there, particularly about some of these roster decisions. I'm glad that he's kind of on Team Hamlin with me. I think it's going to be really interesting to see ultimately how this shakes out. But I do find it interesting. There does seem to be a bit of a media consensus. How many guys, are we talking about that are really off the beaten path in terms of 53-man rosters? Like, I don't really think we're in for a surprise, Bruce.
I think one of the reasons we're not in for a surprise this year relative to last year is because we actually saw the preseason games this year. Last year, they keep a linebacker that none of us even had an idea was going to make the team. And we, of course, weren't able to see any of the practices. We weren't able to see any preseason games. I think that with the advent of play your starters less in preseason, you've been able to get a really good idea.
That's right.
I would be amazed if 53-man roster projections across the NFL were not more accurate this year than they have been recently. I have no way of tracking that. But when you just look at this shortened preseason and how teams have started to behave in specific ways when it comes to their starters in preseason, nowadays, if somebody doesn't play a lot of snaps, you're like, okay, that guy's probably making the team. That's just the way it is. So it's completely different. So as we move into the last phase of Food for Thought,
the dessert menu,
we are going to tell that story. We are going to tell the story. If Joe Marino is in the comment section, we are going to tell the story because you and I made a trade, as you and I have been known to do on occasion. We have made a couple of trades. For those of you who do not know, Nate and I, Joe Marino, and some other Bills content creators, in addition to some media, we are in a dynasty fantasy football league. And the reigning champion of that dynasty football league, I forget, Nate, who was it? Who is the reigning champion of that league? It's me, ladies and gentlemen. I won the inaugural season of this particular dynasty league. And I have a good team. I feel good about my team. But Nate and I have had some conversations in the past. We made a blockbuster trade last year that involved Nick Chubb, Saquon Barkley, a couple first-round picks, Joe Burrow. It was big. It was real big. One of the biggest trades that happened last year. And today, we have been chatting back and forth, and Nate is really high on Saints wide receiver Marquez Callaway. And I am really high on Marquez Callaway, who happens to be on my bench. And Nate and I were having conversations because he had David Montgomery on the trade block. Well, we ended up making a trade that was essentially straight up Marquez Callaway for David Montgomery. And immediately the chat just lit up like a Christmas tree. And Nate, I got to be honest, I didn't think it was that bad.
I like to trade for both of us. Listen, at the end of the day, as you mentioned, I'm pretty high on Marquez Callaway. And I think for me, with a David Montgomery, I'm pretty deep at running back. I wasn't the deepest at receiver, particularly at the top. And what I'm hoping for is a boomer bust candidate here in Marquez Callaway. And I think for me with David Montgomery, Josh, I could agree. I may have overpaid slightly for Callaway. Here's my justification though. I got a real flash in the pan performance over the last 6 weeks for David Montgomery last season. He was the reason I made the playoffs. I started this league last year 1-6, and I made it to the semifinal of our playoff in our first year of the dynasty. And a lot of that was the trades that I made at midseason to kind of flip my roster from being very bad with some injuries to competitive and on track. And ultimately, I got lucky in the first round. Who did I beat? Did I beat Joe Marino in the first round? No, who did I beat? No, I beat Del Reed in the first round in a big upset during the playoffs last year.
No, you didn't, because I beat Del Reed in the championship.
Who did I beat then?
I don't know.
Maybe, it was a big upset. I know I beat somebody and it was an upset. I think it was Marino. I think I beat Marino. I don't know.
Is that why he's so upset?
He might be that way. Actually, listen, I either beat Marino or he didn't make the playoffs. Either way, I just all I hear is a lot of stone throwing from a guy that finished below me in year one. But at the end of the day, the thing I love about, and listen, did I buy into the preseason hype too much? A little bit. But what I will say is Jameis Winston in that offense is going to throw to wide receivers. He's going to throw the ball down the field. I'm actually more excited. I was talking to somebody about this today that asked me about the trade on Twitter. And I said, think about this. I'm more excited about Callaway's fantasy value when Michael Thomas comes back, because then you are not going to be bracketing coverages at all on Callaway once he starts dominating. He's the team's number one pass target outside of Almira. And downfield, this isn't Drew Brees. He's not going to be checking the ball 10 to 15 times down to Alvin Kamara every week. Is Kamara still going to have fantasy value as a pass catcher? Absolutely he is. He's going to do that every year, but he's not getting 115, 120 targets this year from the running back position. Those are going to be dispersed more evenly through the wide receivers because we have a quarterback with an arm that can throw it downfield, stretch the defense, and the downfield acumen that I saw on Thursday night last week, on Monday night from Callaway, the ability to get the ball, to catch it in double coverage in tight spaces. I really like him as a boom candidate this year. And for me, I was looking to move on from Montgomery. I like Myles Gaskin. I've got him as my third running back. I got Mike Davis as my second running back, who I'm very high on this year in the Atlanta offense, and a rebound year for Atlanta on that offensive line. I know Julio Jones. I think they are going to commit to running the football, but he's a huge value for me as a pass catcher, and I have Nick Chubb as my number one running back. And I just needed some boom potential out of my wide receiver position. He's 23 years old. In my opinion, I think you're going to end up with a nice player in Montgomery. Do I believe he's going to finish the season running back 4 again? Absolutely not. I believe I got a really good opportunity to get that flash in the pan. I probably got the most I'm going to get out of David Montgomery over the course of his fantasy career. That offensive line might be the worst in football. That's not going to be a very good team. They're going to be playing from behind a whole bunch. So I think from a move for positional value, I think it was a move that I think two young players, but Callaway's 23 years old, and he's going to be wide receiver 1 going into at least midseason. And once he gets into that wide receiver 2 role and he's not seeing any bracketed coverages, I like the move for myself. And like I said, Joe Marino, when I am right about Callaway, will owe me my due on his podcast. Damn it.
You know what? I'll level with you. I didn't think it was that bad for all the same reasons that you thought. I think that the youth thing has to be taken into consideration because it's a dynasty league. You have to consider the youth thing. And mind you, I had Jameis Winston, so I passed up on the combo. So that's important. Yes, Joe in the comment section said that Nate beat Matt Perino in the first round of the Fantasy Playbook playoffs. I stalled so you guys could make sure that you put some questions in the comment section, and we've gotten some. Josh McCartney says, is there a chance they keep 3 quarterbacks out of fear of losing Fromm to waivers? Guys, I don't think Jake Fromm has value. No, I don't think he has value to trade, and I don't think he has value to waivers, because the only thing that the NFL teams has seen from him is all of the teams in the league pass on him 4 times, some of them passing on him more than 4 times, and a preseason game. And that's it. And so if there aren't exciting physical tools that make you think untapped potential, and you don't have a lot of film to go on, then I don't think Jake Fromm has any value. For me, no.
I don't think we've had enough hot takes on this show, Bruce.
Okay. Well, are you ready
just in general? Just in general. I'm just saying. So right now, what I'd like to tell you is my hot take is there's a better chance that Jake Fromm isn't even coming back to the practice squad after he clears waivers. I think there's a better chance that the Bills go find another quarterback with better intangibles, with better tools that get shaken loose from another team to add to their practice squad than Jake Fromm does hit in his chances of actually being on this practice squad. I think does that certify under hot takes?
Absolutely, that certifies under hot takes. Having someone in your building for over a year now and deciding, you know what, we've seen enough of this guy. Not only are we going to get rid of him, we're not going to bring him back to the practice squad. He was our quarantine quarterback. We're going to quarantine him even farther away from the team this year on somebody else's roster and go get somebody else. Joe Marino says, Bruce beat me 202 to 114 in the round of the playoffs. Yeah.
That's what you call a spanking.
I had a good team last year. I think I have a good team this year. So Joe Marino says Nate is even lower on Jake Fromm than me. Right. I agree with that. Chris Janke says, what happens to Tommy Sweeney? Neither of you mentioned him. Tommy Sweeney, he comes into the league and as a 7th round pick, and you go, yeah, okay. If this is 30 years ago, Tommy Sweeney is a perfectly reasonable tight end. He does what you need him to do. There's nothing particularly exciting about him. He's good enough at this spot. I think he's a perfectly reasonable TE3. And then he gets hurt this year. And you think to yourself, how much have you really seen of Tommy Sweeney, especially when you have an 11 and 10 based offense in the personnel groupings that are going to have lots of wide receivers, and you're better at wide receiver. Are you really going to sacrifice talent for numbers? This is the same conversation I had when in regards to the defensive line, which is, are you going to sacrifice talent for numbers? Are you going to say, well, I really want to have 3 tight ends and a fullback, so I'm going to pass on a more talented wide receiver to get the numbers at a position I'm using less of?
That's right.
So for me, Tommy Sweeney is simply a victim of the idea that they're talented other places, and 3 tight ends and a fullback might not be in the cards.
I think he's on a practice squad. Having said that, right, I think both of us left him off our 53-man roster. I think that's just the way. I think that's just the way that this roster is going to shake out. Like, to your point, stylistically, if he brought something, maybe he had some top end speed. He's a Brevin Jordan, right? Like, he's a guy that has some level of tool that you're like, this guy has tool. We can find a way to make this work on the 53-man roster. That's not a shot at Tommy Sweeney. I think if he had to come in, if you have an injury to Dawson Knox, I think he can come in and you can insert him into a lineup and not feel like you are sacrificing a non-NFL caliber player in the lineup. So I think he's a good practice squad candidate. I just don't believe there's room for him on this 53-man roster with the amount of people I believe that they're going to need to have at the wide receiver position on the roster.
EB in the comments says, QB Gordon, Bruce, referring to Anthony Gordon, former Washington State quarterback. I was high on him, as high as you can be on someone who you want to take in the 7th round, if that's a thing. I'm really high on taking this guy with the last round of the draft. And
if anyone was watching the NFL Network game tonight, which is Minnesota and Kansas City, Shane Bichelle out of Kansas City is a guy that's got some tools. He's got the arm. That's what I'm looking at for the Bills here. And do they try to make a move that they want to bring Davis Webb back to the practice squad, but find that second guy that maybe he's got developmental traits? And I think at this point, anyone that's looking at Jake Fromm and seeing developmental traits, I just got to ask you, in what world? And this is not, this isn't pick on Jake Fromm time. I just don't believe he has the sort of traits that make him worth a practice squad spot when there aren't real developmental traits to be had or in there, right? Like, he's what they've had classically on this practice squad for year in and year out. He's the Jeff Tools of the world, right? The Jabron Hamdens, guys that just are not legitimate NFL. They're borderline NFL players. And I think Jake Fromm fits the bill for borderline. In fact, I would put him in the category. I just don't believe he has NFL arm strength.
I think one of the things we need to do as an NFL society is we need to kind of rewire how we view backup quarterbacks, because historically we have seen backup quarterback traits as being lack of traits. That's what we say. Oh, his upside is a backup. When you hear someone say his upside is a backup, he means he doesn't have tools.
Yes.
And for me personally, if you're going to give me a backup quarterback, if I can't get competence, at least give me variance.
Yeah.
I'll say that again. If I can't get competence, at least give me variance. Give me some sort of boom or bust, because you're already taking such a significant step back from Josh Allen to whoever that player is.
Doesn't matter who it is.
At least introduce a level of chaos. This
is
the reason
anarchy.
why I want Anthony Gordon. Give me YOLO. Give me something. Give me some sort of chaos that can increase the probability, because what we do is we have a backup quarterback and say, come in and just don't screw it up. I'm sorry. Quarterbacks are too important for that now. Backup quarterbacks as a position, because quarterbacks as a position, are too important for it to be just don't screw it up. Mm-hmm. Give me something. Give me a runner. Give me someone with a huge arm. Give me someone with a great deep ball. Give me somebody with some semblance of traits. It is everything that is against what Jake Fromm is. So for me, like you said, Shane Bruchelle, give me that. We have another take. Chris Jenke, what are the chances that Obata doesn't make this team? I'll level with you. At the very beginning of this, I was like, how are they going to find room for Obata? At the end of this, I'm going, they're going to find room for Obata. I would be floored if it came across and Sal Capaccio or Joe Buscaglia or Matthew Fairburn tweets out and they say the Bills have released defensive end / defensive tackle F.A. Obata. I would be shocked. Nate?
Same. I would be floored. Obata has turned himself and has found himself a role on this team as the Quentin Jefferson as I think what they wanted from Quentin Jefferson, right? Is a guy that could bounce inside, he could bounce outside. I think you're going to see a step up from Obata over Jefferson. I thought it was a controversial move for them to move on from Jefferson. I thought that he played well enough last year in a role that he really wasn't signed to play. He was playing way more one technique than I think they wanted him without having Star Lotulelei. I don't believe that's the best possession for his success. But I think when you're talking about Obata, you're talking about a guy now that I think fits really well on that interior third down NASCAR lineup that I think you're going to see a lot of this year. They have so many options, Bruce. Leslie Frazier has never had this level, and frankly, neither has Sean McDermott, this level of variation that you're talking about, right, with the quarterback position. Well, they're going to have plenty of variation at the defensive end and the edge position and getting after the passer. They're going to be able to rotate through tons and tons and tons of personnel groupings along that defensive line. I'm really excited to see what a first down group looks like compared to a third down group, because I think you're going to see a lot of variance in this defensive line. But yeah, Obata is a lock on this roster. If to your point, if it turns out that he doesn't make this roster, I would have to say someone made an unbelievable impression. Antonio Williams ran for 200 yards on 5 carries. I don't know what would have to happen for Obata to not be on this roster. I'm not sure that I've got a scenario off the top of my head.
I don't either. Ladies and gentlemen, we did it. We did the food for thought thing.
We did the thing.
We did the thing. The thing has been done. Somebody in the comment section says, "Where is the tequila?" I don't think I can do tequila while I'm doing a podcast, Nate. I don't know about you, man. That's just, it's a little much for me, ladies and gentlemen. I'm
more of a mezcal guy myself, so
yeah, no, I'm good. So we did it. And last week Nate made me do a terrible impression because I didn't have a sign off, but this time I have a sign off. You can all let me know what you think. Thanks for stopping by Food for Thought. We hope